Good day, and thanks for joining me today on my talk about Is That Project Ready for You? Or an introduction to how open source maturity models have changed over the ages. But first of all, I'm Dave McAllister. I'm the open source technical evangelist at Nginx. I focus a lot on the Nginx open products. Nginx has been open source since its very beginning, and we have a number of projects that we'd love to be able to introduce you to. However, everybody's made up of a lot of other data points, so a couple of others. I'm an open source geek. I started with Linux 0.9.3. I'm a standards wonk. I helped create the ISO 32000, otherwise known as the International Standard for PDF. I'm owned by 3 cats. I'm used to being ignored, so hopefully you don't ignore me too much during this talk. And finally, I spent 10 years as a soccer ref, so I'm used to being disagreed with. On the screen is my LinkedIn. Feel free to drop me a message and let me know when you agree with me, disagree with me, or think I've left something out. So, why are we even talking about this? Well, first of all, open source is great. It's got innovation, it's exciting, it's easily available. You can find a project that does almost anything. The problem is that those projects are in various states of completeness or continuity. And so some questions you have to ask, especially if you're moving towards a production environment. Is it ready for prime time? Which means, is it stable? Is it going to be constantly changing in such a way that you don't want to disrupt your production environments? Is it supported? If there's an error or an issue or a question, is there some place you can turn to get the help that's necessary? And finally, is it advancing? 10 years ago, we talked about monoliths and solid single application architectures. Now we talk about microservices running in orchestration, in nodes, containers, pods. The world changes constantly. So is the application you're interested in keeping up with that? But that actually depends a little bit on your point of view. And this is, of course, crossing the chasm. And everyone's probably heard of that at this point in time. But for this, we can break it down into kind of 2 separate pieces here. We have the early adopter community, people who are looking for a competitive edge in their products and their technologies. They're willing to not have documentation. They're willing to comb through the code and figure out what's going on. And in fact, they're willing to take that code and roll their own unique environments out of that, likewise maintaining them. Which of course means support, not really important. It's my thing here. And of course, in this competitive edge, sometimes clunky can be a little bit charming around this. We also have the other side of this chasm, and that's the pragmatist environment. And pragmatists like mature products. They want things that they grab, they plug in, and they just work. And so that means that they need to be easy to use and understandable in their packaging and their presentation model. They need to be high quality and they need to be fully functional. They're not going to go change the code to make something better or to make it fit their environments either. They want support. That support can come in lots of places, whether it's community support or commercial support. They still want support. And finally, documentation is needed for these people because they need to get up and running as fast as possible with what the base product is capable of doing at that particular point. So, maturity models help us understand where projects are so that we can successfully compare them. And by the way, maturity models are also really useful with your open source projects. Measure against what the maturity model looks like, and you'll get an understanding of what the external world looks like. So, but a quick brief history here. The first concept of this maturity model kind of started in 1993 with the SEI's Capability Maturity Model. And it was actually built for DoD to manage and monitor and try to rate how contractors were capable of filling needs. From then, it sort of grew up, and then we ended up with the open source world really taking off after the turn of the century. And we saw Capgemini's open source maturity model, the one for Navica. Then we had this qualification selections, a broader brushstroke, all the way down. You can read them yourselves here. The problem is that in that point in time for these maturity models, there were lots of different constructs around that. There were not as many foundations. There was not as much commercialized use of or commercialized delivery of open source. And so when we look at these things, they were very much measuring the functionality and the capability of these. I spent a lot of time working with the one from Navica. It's my personal favorite. And as you can tell, there's a lot more to choose from around here. And they all have pros and cons. But when we look at these, they actually all break down. And this is actually more of a summation of the elements from a number of those different maturity models, plus some additional aspects of my that I think are more important for us to be considering today as well. So first of all, functionality testing. Those are pretty obvious inside of here. The things that are not as obvious that you need to consider inside of here are the people aspects here. What's the leadership? What's the culture of this? Has the community matured? Is the community in thrash mode for that? And so when we look at this, it's not just the functionality and quality control, but it's the usability of this and the community backing that project. Maturity models also should be able to look at two things: what the current state is and what we want the desired state to be. And therefore, we're not measuring against a hard and fact 1 million lines of code equals a score rating of 3.2. We're actually going to be measuring across what is important to you, the person looking at making use of that project. And so let's break it down a little bit. So maturity models need to describe a few things here. And there are three assessments that are kind of important to make. One, what are the product elements here? And by this, we start looking at things like, what's its performance characteristics? And performance can mean, is it fast enough? Does it use a lot of resources or a little bit of resources inside of that? How well does it scale? In our modern application environments powered by microservices architectures, scaling is really important. Likewise, in an ephemeral and elastic cloud environment, scaling is also incredibly important, especially when we are in the ability to scale to meet needs for that. Usability. Can someone actually use this without having a magic wand in their back pocket? This is really important here. Interestingly enough, does it work correctly? Quite often we see projects that look great, but not necessarily give us the results we want to. Accuracy and precision are really important when we start looking at that world. Obviously, no license conflicts. We don't want to have conflicts with our existing code, our existing environments here. And unfortunately, lawyers do tend to have to get involved in that particular category. Easy to install. Is it easy to install, or am I going to have to jump through hoops? Are there packages that I can make use of? Or am I going to have to actually do makes to build this for my unique environment here? And then finally, does the project have a roadmap? Do I have the ability to look at where it's going? Or does it have clear updates so that when things change, I know what changed, why it changed, and to a point, how it would impact me? So next, what are your weighting factors here? This is where you're going to have to be a little bit more involved here. Every company, every person's weighting factors are probably different. And this is where you start looking at and going, in this collection of pieces, how important is each piece? And then how much do I need outside support? How much do I need all this innovation work here? Am I okay if I just adopt the code and use it? Or can I find people that already know this? Or will I have to train a staff to be able to maintain this in a running production environment here? Will it be here next year? The number of projects that are really cool, really complete, written by two guys who went off to the next cool thing are astounding. And then finally, is it a hot project? Everybody's talking about it, but is it hot because it's useful, or is it because it's hot because it's hyped? And those become really unique pieces around your weighting across those topics for that. And then when we start looking at this, those assessments come down to your overall score. That score is the item score, is the rating that you assign to it, and the weight you assign to it. Let's step into this a little bit. Rating is what you can discover from the outside, or if you are a contributor to the project, somewhat from the inside here. But think of this as if you were coming in cold to look at a project, Acme, Anvil, e-ordering, commerce environment for this, how much can you discover that's actually from the outside world? And things like GitHub give you the ability to look at the community of activity, the activity in code and so forth, but not all tools do that for that. There's also a sectional score. There are two sections that we look at here: the functionality, the product capability set, as well as the people set. So our scores there are the sum of the scores divided by the count of the item scores. And so if I've got 9 items, so forth. Keep in mind, however, that anything you've assigned a weight of 0 to should not be in your count. It doesn't exist. It's one of those wonderful null aspects in that. It's going to be a little bit more challenging if you're trying to build a spreadsheet around this, but just keep in mind that anything with a 0 rating doesn't count in your sectional scores. And then there's a final score, which is simply the sum of the sectional scores. If you decide to add sections, you would simply increase that model to do the same thing. Now, product factors. And we talked a little bit about this, but we're going to go a little bit deeper into pieces of this. First of all, there's the packaging aspect. Quite often, I don't want to have to go through loading and building a make file. I want everything to just be there. I want to grab it and install it on my Fedora or on my Debian or my Ubuntu. I want to be able to just simply make it work because I want to solve a problem. And my problem is not how much code I can write, but it's how fast I can solve the issue that's keeping me from doing something. There's a Murphy's Law that basically says anytime you do something, you will have to do something else first. I don't want to necessarily be put in the place of having to build my package before I can make use of my package whenever I can. Training. Do I need to be able to expand training to a larger group of people? And if so, am I going to be responsible for the training, or can I say that's somebody else's problem for that? Dependencies on other products. So is this a truly standalone, or do I have to make sure that I have other things installed or make use of other projects that may be out there? If so, they need to go through a similar maturity exercise so that you don't end up with a dependency that's suddenly stalled while everything else continues to advance. And then things like functionality, code, design, and architecture are pretty obvious. We're developers, we're DevOps. We understand that model. And so it really is useful for us to be able to look at and take a look at this code and its architecture and make sure it fits right for us here. One of them that's quite often glossed over is, are the testing practices exposed? Or is it simply a message that says, oh yeah, we test this code? Past history. I had one company that we released a product, not open source, and by the end of its development cycle, it was getting these amazing scores on the QA testing. And then what we found out was that the engineers were simply marking those tests as invalid testing procedures rather than fixing the things that were causing those tests to fail. Needless to say, that was one of the worst releases in the history of that company for that. And of course, capabilities, support, documentation. We talked a little bit about usability before, but especially if we're being exposed to the outside end user world, that usability becomes even more important. People may hate things like Photoshop, but it's still out there, because it is a usable product and people understand it, people can receive training on it, it does what it's supposed to do. So the thing that gets added, though, is this concept of people and some other factors inside of here. This is far more important than it was when these maturity models started, because now we have a totally different environment for open source development. We now have corporations who have people who just support open source communities. Look at OpenTelemetry. There's hundreds of companies contributing to the OpenTelemetry projects inside of that. Similar, you can find them all over the place. Kubernetes is another example for this. So let's take a look at this. Is this product, this technology itself advancing? 2015, Kubernetes hit the marketplace. By now, Kubernetes owns that marketplace for container orchestration for that. Does it support standards? This is important because we don't want this to become a new form of lock-in. And this can be data standards, it can be communication standards. But imagine that you find a project that only makes use of some network protocol that hasn't been around since the 1980s, DECnet, as an example. We need to make sure that we're supporting the right standards at the right times. Licenses, we talked a little bit about inside of here. But corporate commitment becomes really important here. Is this project from a company? And is the company committed to continuing that project? Leadership can quite often fold into that corporate commitment. Again, looking at OpenTelemetry, there are hundreds of companies. And so we have to look at what the leadership and the culture is when we start having all those different companies come together for this. How mature is that community? Has the community gone through the standard storming, norming, forming, and performing curves so that the community itself now drives with a mission in mind and a vision in mind? And then how vital, what's the vitality of that community for this? Are there people truly contributing not only code and fixes, but ideas and concepts, as well as outreach? Those will all become part of this vitality issue. Can you find people who know this project? If you're looking at projects that have no one and you're going to have to do all the training, that's going to delay your startup time here. And then, if necessary, how well supported are the end user environments? So do these people have the ability to look at it at their desktop or on their cell phone or on their laptop or on their car? And these are all factors that you need to weight together to make sense of this environment. So when we do this, it's pretty straightforward. You define the requirements. Can give you a good feeling for what the best practice looks like. You then need to locate the resources. And here, this is where your open source repositories, where blogs, where documentation itself is incredibly important for that. You need to decide on the availability of this project. By availability here is not can you go download it or not, but is it continually improving? So the availability of that environment. And then assign a score. The score can be across whatever. I use a scale from 1 to 5 in most of mine, but you need to figure out where you want to assign that score. I tend to start with sort of, if the project is functional, it's a 3. And then I will subtract things or add things based on other factors around that. But honestly, I am looking at the need to be functional as one of my top items. So we then move into weighting factors. You think scores are tough? Weighting factors are actually tougher. What are your required factors? And by the way, it's okay to peek on this case and take a look and see not only what you think, but what other people may think about that. So those factors, go back to that chart right before, these factors are how important are they to you. I favor functionality. I also tend to favor testing and documentation as part of this. And then I do, when it gets into people, I want to understand the leadership and culture. So having done all that and looked at this, you assign your weighting factors around this. There can be lots of interesting fudges that happen for that. Oops. So what I'm going to do is take a quick sample here. And this is called Nginx Unit. Unit is a data plane. It's an app server, dynamic, polyglot, understands multiple languages, reverse proxy, static file server, available for Unix-like systems. And you can find it, more information, hg.nginx.org/unit. You can find it on GitHub under github.com/nginx/unit. So there's lots of places. It supports multiple languages, and it acts as an app server, removing the need to configure and drive the applications and putting that into a dynamic real-time approach. So Nginx is open source. It was introduced, I think, in 2017, if memory serves me correctly, for that. And as such, there are certain aspects that are really kind of important. So this is the Nginx unit open source maturity model. Now, I will tell you that I built this while I was interviewing. And so I didn't have inside views to this. Over here, you can see that, for instance, my functionality has a rating of 4.1. This thing is actually really, really good for that. It has a weight of 4, and therefore it has a score of 16.4. I also build this thing called a power ranking. And the power ranking is the maximum score, maximum rating, times the weight used as a percentage. So in this case, I could get a 50, I could get a 5, get a 5 times 4 being 20, 16.4 divided by 20 is 82%. Now, when I start going down here, it gets a little bit interesting. So for instance, testing practices. There are no descriptions of the testing practices around unit. However, it does say that Nginx, the corporation, tests this extensively. Now, I actually trust them. Can't imagine why, but I do trust them. But it is something that I can't find there's anything there. And so I ended up with sort of a 3 ranking. And going down here, one of them I want to call out in particular is license choices, particularly around conflicts. Conflicts are crucial. You need to be able to look at this. You don't want to suddenly get caught up into a licensing confrontation or battle of some point. And so the license choice is also usually heavily driven by a legal involvement. We have lots of classes of license from the copyleft model all the way down to permissives, and one's kind of in the middle. My rating for this, in this particular case, is Apache 2. Apache 2 is a nice middle-of-the-road one. It covers IP capabilities, and so I don't have to worry quite as much about sabotage or submarine patents or things like that flowing up here. However, from a corporate viewpoint, where I was going to use this, it's incredibly important, so it actually has a 4.5 rating. You can look down these and see there's very little training available, but it may not be necessary. It's a behind-the-scenes project for that. The source code is available. The source code is understandable. I can contribute to the source environments. I can take this source and build what I want to out of it. But now let's step down and look at leadership and culture. Nginx leads. This has been an Nginx project. It was built by Nginx. Nginx leads. And there's not necessarily a great community around it, but the company, Nginx, and the community driving it right now is pretty solid. So the usage is the focus rather than the development or innovation as the focus to the outside world. Likewise, that vitality falls in exactly the same category for this. Where we do start seeing things sort of drop here is there's not a lot of talent because this project is not something I can easily get involved with. I have to jump through some hoops to do this. It also doesn't have a lot of end-user support. It's not an end-user project. In fact, in this particular case, I almost thought of making this one a weight of 0, but I decided I still wanted to be able to make some use of those things here. Is it momentum-wise? Well, yeah, it's kind of nice knowing that the world is evolving towards app server models, particularly for microservices. They are incredibly useful here. Momentum is beginning to pick up. It's not necessarily really hot. There's not a lot of easy to find use cases around it, but it's there. And then support for standards. Nginx actually wins. They have a lot of support for standards as well as other languages. So summing this all up here, open source maturity models give you a framework for comparison. It doesn't do the work for you. you're still going to have to make the effort to find the materials and find the things that are important for you. Open source can also help you understand the maturity of your own project. And in fact, I would love it if a project would give me an idea of their maturity as an outside view for here. There's no silver bullet. These things change drastically. And for instance, what you might have seen even with Kubernetes in 2015 is not the same maturity you would see today, or OpenTelemetry in March of 2019 versus OpenTelemetry of today. Finally, a tool is only as useful as when it's used appropriately. So keep in mind that this is not something that's going to give you a checklist, but it's going to give you the ability to do comparisons across projects so that you can better understand where your projects align, how, when you're looking at multiple projects, they align, and how easy it is for you to decide whether that project is right for you or whether that project is not quite there yet. So with that, I'd like to thank y'all for listening to me today. It's been great. Again, my LinkedIn, linkedin.com/n/DaveMac. I'd love to hear your ideas and concepts as well around this as well. Feel free to reach out to me there. And with that, thanks for listening.